So when was it that history became your passion? Joe, when did it begin for you?
I think it's sort of my interest in local history really was already evolving by the time I was a teenager, and it was sort of almost accidental. It wasn't through books, or it wasn't like trips to the library, or it was being a goth adjacent teen wandering around in cemeteries. And eventually, just being there and posturing also kind of gave way to like questions and just looking at headstones, because cemeteries are still my libraries in my day-to-day work to this day, because there's so much there. And there are so many questions just provoked by I wanted to know who was in the places where there was obvious graves, but no marker. Why were the women's lives so short? Why were there so many small children? These kind of like questions were really peaked at a young age, and that evolved, as you know, into my project, These Mysterious Hills. I had a column for the Advocate weekly, and then in Berkshires for a number of years. It was kind of still local history, was still a little gothy, haunted houses and the like. And then more and more the houses themselves, and more importantly, the people in the houses, which was always kind of, I think, my angle, even when I was writing about the occult and UFOs and houses. It was human stories of people who lived in the Berkshires and died in the Berkshires and are buried here, and that continuity, to our own lives here.
What's amazing is kind of digging up that paranormal aspect of things, because I think historically, I don't know if it's how we look at history, and maybe it's our own way of sort of rationalizing things with ourselves. We may look at history kind of like Little House on the Prairie. Yeah. Like there's kind of this block that, things were then, and then now we're in today's age, and wow, things are really crazy today. And the closer you get to something, it becomes more complex. But the fact of the matter is, people live very complex lives. There were incredible characters, murderous people, crooked people, and a lot of really weird stuff that happened. And that really was something that clearly you were inspired by in some way. But it's interesting picking up that sort of paranormal side, because I almost feel like that would be harder to research, but it's there though.
Yeah, I mean, it's for somebody like with an anthropological background, it's part of people's lives, whether I believe their house is haunted or not, whatever that narrative is part of people's lives, and it's been part of lives in the Berkshires, going all the way back to when the Shakers really made the Berkshires kind of the occult center of America. This was the birthplace of all this idea of having seances and communicating with the dead.
That's interesting.
Not getting
a lot of people
burned as a witch for it.
Wouldn't look at the Shakers and say occult.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
But
it's been really downplayed. A lot of the weird history of our that's, I think, sort of where I fell into this niche. Was there's so much local history. There's so many books on the Berkshires, and there's so much excluded from it. Whether it's weird paranormal stuff and the occult beliefs, or the narratives of women's history and people of color and the Mohican who occupied this land, that's been expunged. That's been systematically excluded generation after generation.
Is that something that is unique to the Berkshires here?
No,
it's not. So okay, because I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are sort of waking up to how history. And of course, I mean, who writes history, right?
Yeah.
The people who are in control, of course. But it really is interesting. I think if you dig in, because a lot of it's there, how much history has been perverted, I guess, is one way to describe it.
Yeah, it's been very cherry picked, and it's something that, I think you're right. We have this awareness now of things in this American national history context, and we're looking at the Jim Crow history and the Howard Zinn project and things like this. People are really into that, but we don't always think of it as being a local thing. We don't think of the KKK being here in Pittsfield, Mass, and they were in big numbers, things like that. We don't. We kind of, each community has kind of glamorize their own local history and kind of distilled it down partly for tourism, to just keep the narrative straight. It's Melville wrote Moby Dick here. That's what you need to know, kind of thing. The history kind of goes with the venues and the history of with the houses that are gone.
All the Chamber of Commerce friendly stuff,
and
hey,
I'm in the business of doing commercial history. I'm profiling people's houses for money, and I'm doing local history as a commercial enterprise. So there is some natural selectivity there. But every day I'm kind of trying to, with my page and trying to put out additional things, just kind of free information about, because there is this question of like, I'm doing local history. I don't want to speak for women's history or people of color. I don't want to like usurp that voice, but, there is this obligation of like, my own privilege, examining my own privilege as I'm looking into, how that bias has affected hundreds of years of local history for us. And I grew up here, I was born into that.
Yeah. And I don't think it does ourselves any favors to continue with the sort of accepted history that's all nice and whatever, however you want to describe it, which may be more comfortable to a greater number of people, because honestly, history should be interesting. It should be messy. People are messy. Human beings, we don't live perfect lives, and nor would we really want to, because what's the point of this whole thing called life if everything is so simple and straightforward? But so I guess
we all want to know it, but there's not a lot of like wanting to own it. It's like you don't want it. Sometimes you don't want the worst attached to your house or especially your commercial historic venue or things like that. So
maybe there's like a statute of limitations. Okay, we can start the real stuff like 75 years ago or so, right?
People are really comfortable talking about like the May Fosberg murder from 1900, and this glamorous rich girl killed on Tyler Street. That comes up in the groups all the time, but Louis Lent, a little more closer, recent.
Of course,
dead silence kind of thing,
How do you deal with that? But again, real. And I went to school with the victim of Louis, or one of the victims of Louis Lent, and it is hard, but it's still there. It's still real, for sure. Looking at that, so you've seen so much and you've researched so much. Was there one story that really took you down the road where, wow, this is something that I love doing? Was there one that like shocked you to realize that, wow, this is not necessarily the history that I thought was happening here? Anything in particular that struck you early on?
I guess, the one there's just been so many, it's hard to think of one, because I think it's just been this continuous process of shock. And for me, and I'm always like apologizing to the fans on my page. I'm like, I feel like I get a lot of wows on my posts. The wow react more than any other, like more than hearts. And
I love the description, just a series of shock.
But it's like, this is what I'm feeling as I'm studying. I have been shocked at how incorrectly I learned history and at just how much more there was. But the story that I think I revisit and research, I kind of re-research every few years, is how the Salvation Army first came to Pittsfield, and the story of General Lutz, who was the proprietor of brothels and opium dens up and down the East Coast, and set up shop right on Fenn Street. And he had a great kind of 1-2 thing he would do. He would have his illicit businesses and it would go public and there'd be a huge scandal and it would make the papers. People would hear about it all over, but he'd just go to the next town and kind of introduce himself as a reformed sinner. And he was a great like tent revival kind of speaker. And he's like, if a terrible tawdry sinner like me can find redemption, what can the Lord Jesus do for you? And it works, because he'd go, you probably heard about my terrible misdeeds in Philadelphia, as he'd go to Pittsburgh. And he's like, but now I've seen a change. I can show you how to do it. I believe, and he'd just do this in town after town. He did this in Pittsfield quite successfully for a couple of years until the local law came down. Well, first the papers did a big expose on his opulent opium den that he was running on Fenn Street. And
Now, what year was this around?
this is 1889. You know, so this is like as the 1800s opiate epidemic that hit Pittsfield like everywhere, you know, was kind of reaching a peak, you know. So we had started like people started kind of abusing opiates post Civil War, you know, as tends to be the pattern. And after wars, there's a lot of pain management issues that turns into, you know, more. And so, you know, this had been, and opium was legally available. Laudanum, you could buy a 10-gallon thing of laudanum at any pharmacist on North Street. You know, people were dropping dead of overdoses, and Burbank, the Burbank block, and all the poor housing, and sometimes, you know, in very wealthy neighborhoods, elderly women were overdosing on laudanum, and it was like they didn't ban it until 1915.
What is your go-to media? In other words, like when you are looking at a particular issue or a particular person or history, you know, where do you usually begin the process? Let's, I guess, maybe just use an example. Say a famous person, maybe that had a misdeed. I really like those, you know, some murderer or something. I don't know, but like, where do you begin? I mean, I assume newspapers just to some extent are a big piece of it, or no?
If I'm looking at a person, if I want to really get comprehensive on a person, I start kind of with the vital records and the census and stuff. I build the generic skeleton of their life, you know, where they were decade to decade, where they lived, so look at city directories. And then I go to the papers to kind of put the flesh on the bones, because it's easier once if I know what streets they were living on in different decades, and know what towns and where they moved around, where they were born. It becomes much easier to look through this huge amount of, because there's a lot of old newspapers available. There's some through paid databases, and then there's a ton of extinct newspapers in the Berkshire Athenaeum that you can look things up, and things like the Pittsfield Evening Journal and the Pittsfield Sun and the Courier. So it's like a needle in a haystack if you kind of go in without you know, without like a span. You could be spinning through microfiche for days and not find anything. So,
yeah, and you can't like Google through it.
Yeah,
you know.
So I want to know where they were, when their daughter was married, what the dates of everything were, and then I can look in and find, you know. And there's a lot of flesh on those bones, because papers in the old days were like social media now. There was so much, you know, it was almost down to what people ate. You know, it was like every little features on, you know, when people go away on vacation, you know, there was announcements in the paper. It was like, you know, they've taken a steamship to Bermuda for a week, you know, and they'll be back or 6 weeks, you know.
You remember back, you know, when you were in radio back in the day, it was like, you know, when you took a week off, the whole thing was like, oh, well, don't say that you went away on vacation because someone's going to break into your house or something like that. But in the meantime, back in that generation, they're putting it in the newspaper.
Well, and the wealthy wanted people to know, you know, how far they could travel and how long they could be gone for, and that they were going to Cuba or something like that. You know, it was, you know, it was a status. So you wanted to advertise the same as births and things like that. But yeah, it was people visiting. It would publish if you were visiting your sister in Rochester for a weekend. You know, it was little. And I often wonder like how they kept that beat. Did people like show up and just put little things in a suggestions in a pie? It's not entirely clear to me how they got all that information with just a few newspaper men running around. You know, possibly making some of it up, or just, you know, hearing it some third or fourth hand maybe. But
and today there is this sort of perception of, oh, how journalism used to be. Oh, journalism is dead and that sort of thing. But the idea that journalism was some sort of, I don't know, totally respected, or I guess that's the way I would describe it, like totally responsible at one point in our history, is kind of is kind of misleading in that way. Because I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of especially when you have that much paper to fill, that much ink to use, there's got to be a lot of stuff in there that would be more consistent probably than to what we may see on social media today, like you said.
Yeah, the further back you go, the less, if anything, the less reliable, the less responsible, and the more salacious it gets, and the more like almost fictional. In the 1800s, there was no law or real ethical like pressure to make sure all your newspaper stories were true at all. And things, and there was crazy stuff in old newspapers, and some little podunk paper in Arizona would write that they found like giant skeletons. They just slow news day, and they just make up a lost city in the Grand Canyon. No, fake sources. Dale Klemhauper said, blah blah blah, and the New York Times would just run it. They'd get it up over the telegraph wire, and they just run it, no questions asked. So yeah, if anything, if there was a responsible journalism, it was more recent, and maybe there have been some peeling back over the last 40, 50 years, but that responsible kind of truthful journalism idea is largely 20th century born. It didn't really exist in the 1800s. They weren't worried about truthfulness or accuracy terribly much at all.
We didn't have any giants out here in the Berkshires at all.
We had wild men in the woods. That was what the papers here ran with.
Is that what it was? I mean, you wonder like how much, like where does that seed come from? Like, okay, well, there's wild men in the woods. I don't know what the story is. Tell me about the story.
Going back to, there's probably I think there's a newspaper hoax going back to the 1760s, before we were even a country. Great Barrington, there's a story about an ape-like man, and this is 200 years before anybody's saying the word Bigfoot, before that's like become a trend. But these this ape man story that was captured in Great Barrington, and this is colonial times, and then in the 1800s, there would be rumors that there were hoaxes, especially up in North County, where there was a little bit maybe more forest around the Vermont border. There was a bunch of these stories that people come out of the woods and say they saw it, or they catch it, and they get a whole bunch of people. They line up at a barn and get disappointed when there's nothing there.
There's nothing there. Well, when you expect the Bigfoot to come around, well, it's not going to come around.
And weird stuff did come around. People would line up to see like a two-headed cat born or something, or a six-legged calf that was born. So you'd hear about an attraction, and people would stop work and stuff and go for an hour to check out these weird oddities and things. So, an ape man, a wild man was, and then there were kind of, also some people living in the woods. There were people kind of on the fringes of society that, so there was like this blur where wild man is kind of like an amorphous term that could mean indigenous people, could mean people struggling with mental illness, living up in the woods. It could mean like a Bigfoot, Sasquatch type legend, Shaggy Dog story. So it was, as a historian, it makes it like, you got to look real close at which kind of wild man, what's the context, what's the era and who's writing it. Because papers had different perspectives too. The Eagle versus the Pittsfield Sun were different parties, different worldviews than is now.
And I worked at the North Adams Transcript. That was my first job out of college. I don't know how much of that paper has been saved. I hope if you're able to go into it's interesting because we're used to seeing things digitally, and maybe at one point you're able to go back and go into the member section and get all those old papers. But generally, microfiche is still the microfilm. I don't know what's the difference between microfiche and microfilm, but that's usually the way, right?
Well, it can be some of the stuff. It's hit or miss. Some sections that we're kind of lucky. A lot of the Eagle and a lot of the Transcript and some of the Pittsfield Sun, even going back to the early 1800s, can now be searched if you get a subscription to like newspapers.com. There's newspaperarchive.com and newspapers.com, and they have different papers in different eras and stuff. So there's some has some, but so it's getting better and more. Not for you still can't it's not like the movies where you Google like what happened to my house 20 years ago and there's like a picture and it looks just like the newspaper, and it's still not like that. But it's getting better, but there's still a ton that's not digitally available,
which of course makes your job maybe a little bit more fun and then maintains that sort of specialty expertise, because Now you gotta still know where to go, whether
Yeah.
it is the local house of history or, these different houses of history in a way.
Yeah, it is sort of something that just kind of became a specialty because I was doing, writing pieces, writing articles for different papers and magazines and trying to find out. So I had to kind of learn how to find out, how you search deeds and how you search census records and all the different maps from Berkshire history, because there's all these different eras of maps and some are more accurate than others. And it almost takes all. When I profile a house now, I'm doing a little bit of all these things. I'm looking in city directories, some of the old phone and street directories that go back, and you can find hard copies at the library back to the 1800s, with just listings of who lived on streets. It's very valuable, but you've got to almost bring it all because there's holes in the deeds, and when it gets in the 1800s, they sometimes like don't bother to mention who they bought the property for, and you're just like, you've been tracing it back and you're just dead end.
If you go far enough back, they actually have what the name of the owner on the map, because there are that few houses out there. But like, you'd be on like, I don't know, just say Holmes Road or something, and literally you'd actually have the name of the property owner.
Oh, and those are critical. Those have saved me and brought house histories to life, because there's houses that have been wrongly recorded too, that are even, they have a Form B in the Mass Historic Registry, but it's got the wrong date. It was Bill, got confused with another house because people were trying to do this research in the 70s and 80s when it was not as easy to, and you got as far as you could get with what was hard copy, and you couldn't keyword search anything anywhere. And so there's a lot of wrong information still in the local that's got to be corrected. But the maps are hugely helpful when you can actually look at the footprint and say, like, this is the corner of, First Street and Orchard and 1876, and this is who lived there, the name and the basic shape of the house. It's very helpful.
What I really like is the historical perspective on, and if people who are listening in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, there's been a very concerted effort to work on two neighborhoods. One is the West Side neighborhood, and the other one is the Morningside neighborhood. And traditionally, they've been both looked at and are socioeconomically challenged, and ultimately, have been focus points for the city. You've talked about the Morningside neighborhood quite a bit in a way that I never knew before, which is the neighborhood in itself really didn't exist in the way that it is today years ago. And what was Morningside back then, I think, was a totally different location, which is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's a wild thing about how, both on the Morningside and West Side, there have been a lot of changes in how neighborhoods are conceived and drawn, and where they line up, and some of it's had to do with the different waves on the West Side, especially. There have been a lot of different incarnations of, you have an Irish neighborhood, down around Madison Ave and Seymour Street, and that area in the 1800s that then becomes a Polish neighborhood, and it has it kind of, but then it's kind of boundaries changed a little too, because so boundaries of things. But Morningside was conceived as a private estate. Morningside was, the original Morningside was a house that can still be found on Perrine Ave. It's been subdivided into apartments, but it was a Supreme Court justice's house who left the court after the Dred Scott decision, Justice Curtis, and he built a mansion probably about the same time as Springside House, possibly the same builder. And that was sold to Kellogg, who was a big deal at the time, and he already owned kind of what would be south of, or south of Tyler Street. Tyler Street wasn't really much of a thing. So
Tyler Street's the main thoroughfare now for that neighborhood, but probably what's to.
Yeah, there was not a house out there, really until around 1900s, late 1800s, a few, things. But most of North Pittsfield is kind of this open, big farmland for, the first couple of centuries of Pittsfield. And then, so you had Curtis Woods and which was kind of like their Springside Park. Springside was all open farmland, and then Curtis Woods was kind of where the residential housing off of Springside is now, Brown Street and Draper and all those. That was the Woods back then, and so Kellogg turned this all into combined all of his property with what he bought from Curtis and made it Morningside, and came up with the name in 1872, I think. And then Abraham Burbank came up with Evening Side, which is you never hear about anymore, but that he named the neighborhood on the other side of Upper North Street Evening Side, because west and east.
And
but
yeah.
but so I mean, what was originally Morningside is kind of this area above Tyler Street, really above Springside Ave, Brown Street through Norman, Perrine.
I see. Yeah.
And the original house Morningside is in Perrine, but that later was just kind of cut out in the most recent, as it's been redrafted by 2004. That's what was the original Morningside isn't in the Morningside neighborhood anymore. And partly the neighborhood changed over decades. It moved further down Tyler Street and out towards the jail and things like that, as GE's housing, the housing around GE expanded.
Yeah, and just so people understand, I mean, GE was really, it ran adjacent to that whole corridor, and then presumably, I don't know if it's exactly the case, but it seems like housing kind of sprouted up around it to be conducive to, and a lot of people actually, I think, walked to work. For a year. I mean, a long time ago, they used to talk about that damn GE traffic. If you were old enough to remember that, but probably, that was still in our childhood. It was still a very, very busy time. In those times when everyone got out of GE. But with that said, there was a lot of people who probably brought their lunch pail and walked right over to the GE.
And originally, when it was William Stanley and early GE, it was the Morningside plant. So if you worked at the Morningside plant and you were walking down to, say, as far as Tyler, Cortland, stuff like that, people, started. So the identity of Morningside expanded out to that area, and then farther, and now it's kind of redrawn. Almost goes all the way to City Hall and the whole what was Pittsfield's Little Italy, Lakeside. Or not Lakeside, but there was Lakewood. Well, there was Lakeside and Lakewood.
Oh, really? There were two
at one point. Because there was and that. But all these kind of neighborhoods, the neighborhood boundaries have changed, and many cases the street, the streets have been, slightly altered, and the houses have been, so there's huge amounts of change, I think, in most neighborhoods, and you see only a few neighborhoods where there's really, they're much like they probably were in the 1800s, maybe Wendell and even Wendell, some, the parts of Wendell and Pomeroy, things that are closest to East Street, you see, preserved. Second Street is fairly preserved as it was structurally. The houses there, a lot of those date back 1870s and earlier. So
that's a good point. You look at some parts of Pomeroy, Bartlett Ave, Wendell, those are, and then if you go the block beyond, further away from downtown, it's still pretty well preserved, and maybe even
I have to give a shout out to, because I got a ton of clients from Pomeroy, Wendell, Bartlett. They love their houses and they're gorgeous.
I really do, and I think people, and part of sort of the reinvestment of people recognizing the value of these homes did happen, I think, in the last decade, 15 years or so, where people really did reinvest in those homes over there. So, basically going over to Colt at the end of it, there, that's a nice area for sure, and a lot of people appreciate the history there. So, tell me about Obie Joyful. You've written about him a little bit, right?
Yeah, Obie Joyful he was a neat guy. He was a lot of walking contradictions, because he'd been vegetarian most of the time. He was one of the first, publicized vegetarians. But towards the end of his life, he was eating nothing but raw meat.
So he moved over to the Atkins diet.
Yeah.
He transitioned.
Yeah, he marched to his own drummer, and he was very well known in Pittsfield. He had business cards that he would give advice for $1. And
when did he live?
I think he didn't die until 60, 61.
Okay.
So he was born in the late 1800s. Came to Pittsfield as an adult. He was not native to here, but he came from out west, and he had been like possibly double married. So there was some like tensions with it, because he was in the papers like here and in other places. He was like known. He was definitely a character, but he would drive around the Berkshires in his Model T, and one thing that people always notice, he was always out in the cold, like coatless, things like that. He seemed impervious to elements. He was like kind of this larger than life character. And he lived in this kind of elevated, it was like a tiny house, but it was like on stilts up in Lanesboro. It was like, the main level was just, it was just like this elevated little shack off the ground. So but he was wildly popular. He was listened to. He was considered like on the fringe, but like a little bit, touched by God, maybe, a little bit, just like he booked out the old Palace Theater. They had 1,500 people, plus another 500. It was one of the first times they piped sound from the Palace Theater over to Union Square, now Barrington, for another 500 people over there to listen.
Are you serious?
Yeah, he gave this huge speech about why men are the fairer sex to thousands, like, and ovations.
I thought it would be something of like great, like just wisdom of living a joyful life or something like
this
that.
Was part of his recipe, apparently. Yeah, he
how men are the
he said the world was wrong, and they were paying. He gave a lot of examples from the animal kingdom, and he's like, look ye upon the he talk about different exotic birds and lines, and then look ye upon the speaker before you, if you need more evidence, because he was extremely vain. He would love to pose for the museum camera club and art schools around here and stuff. So there's a lot of out there. There's a lot of photos and drawings and stuff like in people's attics and things like that. Yeah.
Man, because I played in a basketball league that was called the Obi Joyful Basketball League, and it was like at the boys club over the fall. It was just like a fall or it was a sort of pre-season league, and I think maybe 90% or 95% of the kids who played have this thing that says "Oh, be joyful" on their shirt, and they probably have no idea who the heck that is, or that it's actually a person. Yeah. I always thought it was like, "Oh, be joyful." Like a motto. Just be joyful.
Like an old hymn name.
Which is, did you ever find out where the name came from? I mean, that was something. He had the card. He was handing out the card saying, "This is my name." Kind of. So it wasn't like a nickname.
He just kind of gave it to himself in the 20s. I think he, got his name, legally changed, and which is nobody did back then. I mean, really, unless you were hiding from the law or something. But he did have that double married thing, so that might have had to do with it. But he was a fascinating guy. I think there was a restaurant on North Street. It was a little before I was born. But I guess there was a restaurant called Obi Joyful's for a little while.
Riding off his coattails.
Yeah.
I love your April Fool's jokes that you put on. So this year you said that you were opening a restaurant on North Street, and you had me for a second. Actually, that was a pretty good one. That was last year. You were running for city council. I think that was probably one of those. That was a good year. But So nice one. I don't know. That's a nice sidebar. But the Allen Farm was another one I saw that you had written about at one point. And if you look at what street is it Allen Street, or is it? No, it's not. It's
Allen Gate.
Yep. Allen Gate. That's right. So, and that's literally what the street probably is named after. Oh, yeah. Is that big gate?
Everything out there is named after.
Is Allen this, Allen that? Yeah. So there's a family Allen. And is that the Fighting Parson family? Yep. Okay. So you had an interesting take on this because, again, history those who are in control sort of write history, and and the Fighting Parson, and Allen is great, and everything's named after Allen, Allendale, Allen Gate, Allen this, Allen that. But interesting how that all came about, how that farmland went to that family.
Yeah, well, I mean, the biggest thing, I think, as near as I can tell, the biggest thing historically that the Allen family, for all the things that are named after them, that they did was own stuff. They own stuff. That's really what their contribution primarily. I mean, Parson Allen may or may not have fired the first shot, the Battle of Bennington. I think stuff like that is in the category of legend, because nobody knows who fired the first shot at the battle. But that's always a repeated factoid and things like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, that's mostly what and it's starting early. I mean, Allen was given, a lot of land. He was just the minister, but he owned most of the land around the church, most of, what's now Park Square and stuff. He gave a little bit back to the town to start the cemetery that was about where Park Square was now, and most of downtown. When so I mean, he owned kind of where everything, the police station, city hall, all that stuff is now. That was just like his land. And then over the next couple of generations, like it grew, and and they just kind of grew into more of a wealthy lifestyle, and finally to the Allen farm being, and it was both sides of Dalton Avenue. I mean, it's really from like Dalton Avenue, Egremont, Allendale School area, all the way to Oak Hill. They owned up to there at one point. So it's like a huge amount of Pittsfield now. I mean, you're talking like millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of real estate in today's economy, and they just owned it all. And a lot of, I find a lot of these, when I go to the older houses back to the 1700s stuff, there was a lot of disproportionate, I mean, people after the Revolution, I mean, like the Durwins fought locally, and some of the regiments in the Revolution, we didn't get anything. There was a lot of Revolutionary soldiers who didn't even get their wages, their actual wages for time served. And then there were other people that you see, in these deeds, that they're getting like huge tracts of land. They're getting like 1,600 acres because they bought like, they served for like 3 weeks, at the Battle of Bennington, which was, they were enlisted for 3 weeks of the whole Revolution, and they knew, but they were well connected, and they made the Revolution seemed to be really good for making political connections. If you didn't get killed, you didn't get killed by cannon or something, or die of pneumonia, you could get really well set if you met the right people in the right battles.
It's interesting because there's this kind of like interesting dichotomy there. I don't even know if it's a dichotomy, but you have the sort of Fighting Parson situation, but then generations later, then you have the Samuel Harrison. And I don't know if you have done a lot of research on Samuel Harrison, but I just find it interesting that, of course, and who knows how much the Fighting Parson there is a legend and otherwise, but I think maybe Samuel Harrison and his history, I would say, is probably a much more firmly settled as to what his contribution was during that time.
Yeah. I mean, I think Samuel Harrison's probably much more care. It's probably more of the research has been recent, whereas a lot of because of who Allen was, people are talked about him early, wrote about him early. A lot of the stuff that was written earlier was not accurate, but there was so much of it that it goes uncorrected. A lot of that stuff that's like really core stuff goes uncorrected because it's in so many books already that but the stuff that the people like Samuel Harrison, whose house we almost demolished without realizing it, there's
and
this greater care later. This is this recent thing that we've kind of come to terms with of our history more, so the scholarship's probably, I would say, way better. And I was reading a piece by his son George in an 1890s paper the other day. There was an editorial that I was reading, and
in the 1890s.
Yeah,
his son.
Okay. Yeah. So it was, they were really they were really on on point with the challenges that people of color were experiencing right then, in this Reconstruction period, and there was a lot of this kind of the white arrogance in the North, where we went down south to fight for you, which was, I mean, even in their own lifetime, they had revised it, because that's not why the Civil War started. They didn't go down there to, emancipation was like, an end result. But so even in their own, the first decades after the Civil War, there's people in Pittsfield, and these descriptions of people in Pittsfield saying, I went down south to fight for you and the war, and, it just kind of, it's interesting how, so a lot of the rhetoric is similar to today's Facebook dialogues.
Again, history often repeats itself in some way, shape, or form, and even in recent days, to their credit, the Berkshire Eagle has run stories on the redlining in Pittsfield, which I'm just really starting to dig into myself a little bit. But there's a full committee that's committed itself to doing this work and researching it. So a credit to this committee, and we're looking to have them on the podcast as well, some members of that committee. But that's there too. I don't know if you've seen any of that in your research.
I did. I consulted a tiny bit on that project, and I saw that I was able to see the final presentation for the NAACP. I think it was last week or the week before. Amazing work that committee did, and shout out to Kumar Talaferro, because I've been finding myself overlapping with his interests a lot lately, and finding him kind of just signed into the log at the local history section just kind of right before I've been there. So he really put in the work. He didn't just sit at home on a laptop. He was really digging in the Athenaeum, in the stacks. So there's just really tremendous stuff, and it was eye-opening for me. I learned a lot that I really didn't know after years of writing local history stuff.
So what were some of the things that may have, and I think, and again, in this presentation, what are some of the key indicators or the areas where you're able to see and find this evidence that makes it so clear? What are some of the pieces of evidence that you look for?
Well, there was a lot brought to bear. They looked at censuses, they looked at deeds and mortgages and things that are all. And then there was this kind of elusive map that was almost like a legend. And finally, I guess, there was intervention by Congressman Neal, and it was like a whole thing. They finally found this like 1930s map that was by I had never seen it before. I recognized the name of the engineer, one of the engineers on it, because he did a lot of land plans around, but it was basically sort of a where you should lend, what neighborhoods were good to lend to and what weren't. And when you look at it, there's this clear overlap of systematic kind of defunding almost of disinvestment in certain neighborhoods, and it's very much across lines of color and lines of ethnic desirability for that time period. And it's like it was shocking to see.
I wonder, wow, so it was hidden. I mean, like, and so
it was
where was it hiding?
I don't know the full story how they but I know that they only found this at the very end. They only actually got a copy of it at the very end of this long research process, and with great intervention. So it may have been somewhere in a National Archives or something, but just so there's a lot out there that's just you can't Google, and it really we're going to continue to, I think, make discoveries that are going to, and we have to be ready to revise our ideas as data comes out. That's the most important thing, and that's the hardest thing for humans to do at all. So
it is, because especially when we're invested in the history. And I think that's also an evolution of human beings to be able to accept things. Like it's just like sometimes things suck, and you got to be able to just move on and learn from it, and not be and not try to I don't even know. I mean, I just think you'd rather be authentic. You'd rather be honest with the whole thing, so that you can do better. I don't know. I think, just the fact that this map was hidden under lock and key somewhere, who knows, it's that is amazing to me. But again, understandable, whatever local banks, whatever was happening, they didn't want it to be known.
Oh yeah. And this was, I mean, there's been really systematic, just era after era, calculated in the development. Part of my walking tour will go into how, in the macabre Pittsfield walking tour I'm going to do, it's really 1920s focus, and it's really like how that, as one of the biggest boom decades in Pittsfield history, when we built much of what's here now, much of the city was built during that decade, and how and for who and who was allowed to live where is hugely integral to that story, because we did have this huge boom, from 1900 to 1940. There's recurring, but 1920s saw all this stuff, including like the high school, a lot of the neighborhoods off of Elm Street, some of which were explicitly, restricted.
Sure.
So a lot of these new neighborhoods was just like, it was kind of right out there that they were not available to certain kinds of people, and local banks wouldn't really even loan to people of color or even Italians until the Italians started their own bank, because nobody would loan, and that whole neighborhood on Newell Street, Lakeside, grew out of a little bank on Fenn Street that was Italian run and would loan to Italian. It was just like a wave of houses. People had been saving up money, and they just couldn't get mortgages. They just couldn't get house loans. None of the banks that would loan. So so a lot of different groups were kind of shunted by these decisions into specific parts of our city, and it really it influences so much of how the land is developed to this day. And
again, so like sometimes we harken back and have a rosy outlook on our past, like the kind of ideas that lead to slogans like "Make America Great Again," right? This ideal, because somehow everything was really amazing back in the day, and it wasn't. I mean, there were some things that are great compared to maybe today, but there are some things that were awful.
Most of the, they had most of the same problems, plus a whole bunch of other problems that we've eliminated.
Like when you talk about this, like the idea of the quote unquote desirable Southeast in Pittsfield has a whole new connotation. Like it doesn't feel, it's gross, in a way, because you're like, wow, it's not that this area of the city was so wonderful. It literally, to some extent, with the report on redlining and through other history and other ethnic groups being sort of locked out of the game, it's not a fair fight. As far as that goes, it's really
there's a lot of dark clouds over a lot of things, and this is why my tour is called Macabre Pittsfield. It's not like I'm not doing literary Pittsfield. I'm not doing like, I'm not even doing like the housing of Pittsfield, which is what I kind of do for a living. But it's this part that is, and I'm not, it's like, why are you focusing on the negative from all these different eras of histories? My last tour was like the 1800s and kind of like the prostitution and the opiate like epidemics then, and just like it was like really bad, folks. Like if you were a woman, your life expectancy was crap. Just a lot of things that just piqued my interest. But now it's so era by era, it's like, why do you focus on the negative? Because so many other people have totally excluded it from our histories.
Right. It's egregious that,
to the point we have, a false idea. I mean, we think we're in this world that's spinning into worse and worse chaos when, a ton of this, a lot of this good old days mentality, which we are really deep on in the Berkshires. Almost, I think in some ways we are a little unique to it, because there's things that like, would be Lizzie Borden famous in any other town that we have like, really brushed under the rug, serial killers and this kind of big stuff. So, the dark stuff doesn't fit with, and maybe that's the tourist area thing, but that's,
well, the funny thing
changing,
is,
'cause
I mean, I look at it again. I mean, Salem, Massachusetts
Yeah.
has kind of done a pretty good job marketing something that was really awful over time. And, and not to say you can spin everything to make it all nice and dandy, but at the same time, people like real stuff.
Yeah.
And,
That authenticity.
and the authenticity. So, I mean, there's something that we don't talk about much at all. And I think you've talked about it and written about it a bit, is this how downtown Pittsfield was built. And you've mentioned several times now in our interview about a cemetery and this feeling or this vibe that, and I think, and people who are kind of like into the paranormal, talk about this a little bit. And if they're sensitive to this stuff, they can kind of feel it on North Street. There is a former cemetery
Yeah.
that so tell me how North Street and this whole area around Park Square.
Well, there were several, really, because they we have this weird thing where you can't bury people of different ethnicities and different religions in the same cemetery. So we had the French Catholic cemetery that was on Melville Street, next to the church there. They had their own cemetery. That was the last one to be moved out. There was another cemetery at the Common, which was somewhat to replace the original cemetery. So the original cemetery probably started about the midpoint of Park Square and went north towards about where Fenn Street is. By the time the Baptist church was, because then the Baptists had their own section, like as new churches they had, and that was one thing I never got as a kid.
A lot of churches. I mean, there's two right on Park Square.
Yeah.
There's two right down the street on South Street. There's the Baptist church, all within.
And you can't bury all the different dead together. I mean, even if they lived on the same streets when they were alive, you can't bury them together because zombies, I guess. I don't know. No. So there was this, these different sections, and as Pittsfield grew, it's not uncommon to see small towns with the church, the cemetery right in the main street. But as Pittsfield kept growing, that real estate became desired for, commercial and administrative buildings and things. So these, Pittsfield kind of at first moved the bodies on its own dime, and increasingly the impetus was put on families of people who were interred there to relocate. Yeah. Man, that's audacious, right?
That is ballsy.
Right.
So
and most of these people, a lot of these people were decades dead. They had no kin, or people moved around. Their kin were gone in Troy. They weren't going to hear about this, so a lot of bodies never got moved. That was the long and short of it is, so there's this recurring problem all through the late 1800s into like World War I era, where every time, there's pipes digging or foundation work under the police station, under the churches, all the downtown churches, they're finding, skeletons. They're digging sometimes a dozen skeletons, and just huge, like it was freaking people out. It was gross, and I think, it's still haunts us a little.
Yeah. And again, I mean, some people would say, oh, that's baloney. That who cares? That doesn't mean anything. And there are other people who say, wow, no, there's a kind of dark energy around. And I mean, I don't know if karma, spirituality, whatever, but it can't be the best thing to be digging up graves and I don't know. So
it doesn't scare me out anymore. I eventually came to a point where I'm like, I mean, I think the way it was handled, to know like how kind of blasé and just, just the way it was done kind of is offensive. But the more I think about it, I mean, probably everywhere we walk is graveyard. I mean, humans alone have been walking, this continent, and since before it was this continent, when it was some, I mean, there's human and animal remains under probably every square foot of the earth. So we're just, I mean, I kind of take it as a matter of course, like the planet is haunted. It's just like, I don't worry about which specific houses. The planet is haunted. And even if you
But
take it
some
in the
houses
metaphor
got, I mean,
sense,
some locations are more haunted. I mean, in other words, like,
probably,
yeah, I
maybe.
mean, so I don't know what your spiritual beliefs are. How does that
I
work
don't know
for you?
either.
Do you just kind of, I mean, because you seem like an evidence-based dude, right? So it's kind of like, all right, well, I hear these stories. I mean, have you felt things that made you
I mean, I
feel
think
as though?
everybody does.
I think everybody
It's
does.
how we interpret what we're feeling. Whether we take it as, I mean, the problem is I see myself as a faulty instrument. As scientific instruments go, my perceptions and my senses are, you know, uh, they can pick up a lot, but it immediately, the human brain immediately starts interpreting things, as they come in. So we're shaping every, thing we hear, smell, see into a narrative as it comes into our brain. And I've watched this narrative kind of get out of control where, if there's a false historical story about a house, and there's a confusion, say, Clarissa so and so died there, and the more people hear that story, the more people will like, I heard Clarissa, like I heard a ghost say their name, and then you dig it up, and it's like this person never even existed. So all these people's experiences were, maybe they felt or experienced something, but how much, there's always this question of like, how much of our brain is like turning this into something I can understand, out of billions of possible sensory signals hitting my body at any point. So I mean, I have walked this kind of fine line of like evidence-based skepticism balanced with the fact that, for 17, 18 years I've been writing about spooky stuff, and so people tell me their story. My whole life I've been getting these stories from people, and I don't discount people's experiences. I don't discount their lived reality. um it's just, so my conception of reality is like this big maybe state. It just gets more agnostic the longer it goes. So I'm just like, even if you do see an apparition, does that mean it's the trapped soul of the dead, or is time non-linear, and maybe at certain points we see through, points in reality? I mean, you read all these, there's a bazillion theories. I mean, there's people have been theorizing about ghosts back to, biblical times. So there's and our concepts of what ghosts are, or how they have changed a lot. Even just studying in the Berkshires from the Shakers, in the 1780s and early 1800s, they're communicating with dead. They're talking to Washington and Lafayette, and famous ghosts, and having Native American spirits give them hallucinogenic tobaccos that, are making them, they perceive these experiences as very real. But that's, there's the way that ghosts talk to mediums in the 1800s seems very different from how people perceive them in like a modern paranormal context. They were much more talkative, for one thing. All the ghosts were like, oh, I have come back to tell you, so there was this whole thing. And now mediums are like, I'm getting a name with a K. It was before, it was just like these, huge pronouncements. So our cultural ideas of ghosts, UFOs, all these things, it's been interesting to watch them change. So, and how we,
but it sounds like you're open to having something there. And so whether it's a different dimension, maybe a different, that, like you said, the linear time thing, that maybe there is something else there. Maybe we're on different timelines or something, or what have you. All kinds of
tectonic plates affects, electromagnetism in our brain. I mean, I don't know. This is the thing, is there's so much out there, and there's so much like growing awareness that we can't know. We can't be microbiology. We each can't be microbiologists. We each can't be particle physicists. We can't know all the specialties and all the things that could impact. No one person can have this total perspective, this holistic perspective. We can try to have an interdisciplinary perspective, but there is a lot we don't know. So I try not to make big decisions on things, and absolute pronouncements, unless there's a strong chain of evidence and likelihood. There's some people that, like, your UFO sighting is full of shit. I don't care if you've been on Unsolved Mysteries. That is BS, and your story has changed like about 9 times, buddy. So, I don't know. I don't know if other people have seen a UFO, but I know that guy's lying, because lying is the thing I know exists, and that guy's doing it. So yeah, that's a little bit like that.
I hear you. Yeah, this is good. So tell me about because you kind of highlighted it as we were talking about the redlining stuff, but like when you're working with people, what are some of the things that they're looking for when they're going into the history? Is it for very functional things like, oh, I need to know the history because we need to know why the deed is this way for legal reasons, or is it more curiosity?
It varies. I would say emotional factors are kind of the predominant thing. There are some ways that I can kind of illuminate like why things structurally are the way they are the way they are in a house, based on when it was built or who the previous owners are. And sometimes you can find the building permits and things for renovations. So some people want to know, like, but you can't really, sometimes you can't find out the things like the aesthetic things people want to know, like, why did they do that? Like that, I can't get in their head to like why they went with with the lowered ceiling or the enclosed porch. But you can tell them maybe what year and who did it, who to blame. But it's more a sense of place. I think it's like to know that a wedding reception for somebody took place, in your dining room, or to know, a lot of people do want to know who died in their house. And if your house is reasonably old, somebody died in it.
Sure.
So
I mean, and people died in homes a lot more.
Yeah,
long ago.
Of course.
They weren't going and dying
Yeah.
in a facility or a hospital or what have you. Many more people died at home.
I mean, at some point, everybody, further enough, the oldest houses, everybody died. Where else would you die? Unless you died in your field behind your plow or shot in a tavern or something. There were no hospitals at first. So, the early homes, all the owners died there mostly. And sometimes it's interesting how they died, and the way that a lot of the funerals, even well into the 20th century, the funerals would be held in homes. Viewing would be in homes. You'd have a dead body there for 2-3 days. Even in the 20th century. So
we've become, and I think you hear. I work in healthcare during the day, and you'll hear this more from the hospice people. And they'll talk about how people are a lot more uncomfortable with death today than historically we were, because death was much more personal.
Constant.
It was constant, but also we had a much more personal connection to it because of these reasons that you're talking about. People would die in the homes. People would prepare the bodies themselves. Now there's industries for each of these things. And again, I don't want to get too dark here, but it's not, though. It's actually not dark, because like death is a part of the human experience and everything, but we are not as comfortable today in dealing with that. And I don't know if that's the best thing.
Yeah, it's hard to, we certainly don't see, the sausage, how the sausage is made the way we used to. And we probably, in an average lifespan, don't encounter as much, as frequent death, maybe, as we did in the space of our lifetime, in a longer lifespan with less child mortality, massively less child. I mean, that is when people ask me, what is the biggest thing that you see, the biggest day-to-day difference from different historical eras that I research? Dead children. Like, that is the huge, massive change in society. And people, of all causes, not just from vaccines, not just from disease, accidental death of children was much more common. So there's a lot of things that people criticize about the way we raise children, the way we take care of children now. But one thing is certainly emphatically, like, undeniable from like, more children survive to adulthood from the way that we do things now in many different facets, because just not a week goes by that I don't see stories of kids getting crushed by horse carts, falling out of windows, like catching on fire, so there were more of them. It couldn't be as well attended, these big families. So, the average family saw deaths of their children, the most families did. So, the death was, more, it's kind of constant presence in our life, I think, in some ways, than it is now. Whereas now it is like more of a built up tragedy, to then where, maybe a little more pragmatic and almost like farm slaughterhouse about it. It's just like when you've lost 3 kids, like, the mourning is different from, it's a much more of a rare thing today. So, when a child dies, like, it's a huge deal to us now. There was just, a little paragraph blip from, so
yeah, Joey didn't make
so
it.
common. Yeah.
There it is.
Just so common.
It is, that is amazing. But if you look at some of the famous families that had children die, so presumably, like Abraham Lincoln, I think had a lot of hit. Is that I gotta trust my own history here, but that happened. And so you could imagine if those families that were probably had access to maybe some of the best resources out there, maybe in healthcare or whatever it was being called back then, you can imagine that the average family probably had a great deal of loss. As far as that goes. Yeah, that people, I don't think a lot of people think about that.
No, and it was much more and people were I think that people were a lot more callous to the loss of a child, or even the murder of a child, back then, especially if the child was disabled. I mean, there was a so-called mercy killing in Pittsfield in the 40s that people were on the fence about. A lot of people were on the fence about whether or not this father should have killed his infant son who had Down syndrome.
My God,
because
unthinkable today. Yeah, right. Unthinkable today, but in the 40s, that was actually a debate.
Yeah, people, thought, well, what else was he going to do?
Yeah.
And he was ultimately pardoned and went on to live his life.
Unbelievable. I look at some of these. It's interesting that you talk about, like, for instance, the Italians had their own bank, and that enabled them to, get into housing and that sort of thing, and hopefully build up wealth over time. I'm sure they ultimately did. But you have the Italians, you have the Polish, other ethnicities, African Americans, and it makes you look at things differently when you realize that it wasn't just like, oh, well, we're together, we're going to have a neighborhood together. I think that's kind of the mentality that we have, like, oh, geez, all the Polish people lived over there, that was great, and all the Italians lived over there, isn't that nice? It wasn't because of that. It wasn't, that wasn't the reason. The reason was, like, by absolute necessity that they had to stick together. The ethnicities weren't necessarily nice to each other, and as economically being shut out, that's a big takeaway that I think when people harken back, maybe they don't recognize that these separations of different neighborhoods happened out of that necessity, not because, oh geez, we just want to stick together as an ethnicity. It
was availability of options. And it was just like, enclaves of neighborhoods started because that's where you could access, and they'd have their own stores and things like that. And because nobody was, like, trying to, extend any help over language barriers or anything, like, there was no interest in having a bilingual society or a multilingual society. That, it was just like, you get no slack, and it was just like, you're lucky we let you in this country. So there wasn't this past era where, I think we really, like, had a parade for immigrants. There was never this time when it was like, maybe it's, I think, it might have been less of this charged topic sometimes than it is now, but it was always rocky. It was always rocky for every immigrant group coming here. And it was never like, roll out the red carpet. It was never like, we're begrudgingly doing this because it's our Christian duty.
And we look back at fondness. My dad grew up on Wilson Street in the Polish section of the city. He went to Holy Family Church. And again, you think about it, back in the day, you're like, oh, well, that's too bad. The Polish church is gone, and everything. And Mount Carmel was the Italian church, and you can go right down the line of things. But at its very core, it was
it was
sort
segregation.
of, yeah, it was
Soft segregation.
in a way it was. Even though there's great beauty in all of that comes out of these things, and all the different histories and memories in each of those churches. But I think that is fascinating.
Yeah, I think I was just looking in a little the other day at St. John's, the Ukrainian Catholic Church that was decommissioned a few years ago, and it kind of was interesting how the properties, the kind of little Ukrainian neighborhood, sort of dovetailed with the Polish neighborhood, because they were both, their homelands were both in this kind of wartime situation, similar wartime situation in Europe, and so they kind of like almost, there was a little bit of like helping each other, adapting. The Ukrainians kind of were able to piggyback a little bit on the success of the Polish and establishing a little neighborhood, and built off from there. But yeah, I mean, these things tied into, it was in waves as things, world events, shaped Pittsfield the same as they shaped other places. There's a wave of Russian Jews in the 1890s because of what the czars were doing, and the repressive crackdowns there. So, so everything, and the 20s, I think, is really I think people are gonna be surprised in my tour how things like the beginning of the drug war, alcohol prohibition, women getting the right to vote in 1920, all these things, kind of like these world and national events, really intersect in Pittsfield like so much, and Pittsfield is so part of it still has its own kind of New England uniqueness and weirdness, but it's very much a product of what was happening in the world. Maybe even more so, I mean, I think we're seeing that sort of that now. I mean, the history of Pittsfield from the early 2020s will be laced with pandemic and a new real estate kind of boom maybe, and we'll see. But very similar circumstances 100 years ago. You have the very end of the influenza pandemic, the worst death toll at the time from any plague, and we're coming out of that. We have this building boom going on in Pittsfield. We have a controversial new high school to build. They have the rising opioid crisis again in this post-war environment, and because that really ramps up in the 1920s and 30s, and you see the beginning of like heroin cartels in like New York, and organized crime start to take an interest in Pittsfield, and so a lot of these historical threads that are like very much national things came to bear in making, and then Pittsfield took its own unique ingredients and shook them around with those, and we saw what we got. But yeah, a lot of it was very surprising to me, and I think people who take my tour are going to be, I don't want to give too much away, but there's a lot of murders, jewel heists, bootlegging, the KKK, the Chinese Tong Wars that were going on in the U.S. at that time. A lot of interesting things came to bear in 1920s Pittsfield, and you can actually kind of walk and stand in places where a lot of these things kind of seem like epic, like distant, Great Gatsby, flapper kind of events. It's like, it seems very Hollywood, but it's like this happened. They screened Birth of a Nation, right on North Street, and they had Klansmen riding down the street. Oh yeah, it was sold out. It was sold out, John, in Pittsfield and North Adams. Birth of a Nation went for days, and we had Klansmen riding in hoods promoting it, with handbills on North Street, and then by the mid 1920s, the Klan was claiming they had 600 members in Pittsfield, which was Berkshire Klan 9. So that's there was enough clans that we were number 9.
Wow.
In the county. So yeah, it was. But it was it was this reactionary push to the 1920s saw more mortgages to Black homeowners than the 1910s or the 1930s. But it's still a negligible amount compared to the amount of mortgages. I mean, everybody was building in the 20s, but there's this reaction to a huge amount of Pittsfield speaking different languages now. Probably the most multilingual we've ever been was probably in the 1900 to 1930. So there's this reaction to this radically changing culture, this new modern Pittsfield that doesn't remind them of the good old days.
And because that's in the 1920s. And so take us back a little bit to the original Pittsfield was English. So again, Pittsfield named after William Pitt, who never came to Pittsfield, never came to never came to America pre-United States. But early on, originally again settled by the British. There were indigenous people here that presumably were pushed out. You had
colonizers come in probably around the time of the so-called French and Indian War. Pittsfield was too the Berkshires in general, but Pittsfield and a lot of Western Mass was too engaged in warfare and disputed and conflicts.
There seemed to be a lot of conflict in West Pittsfield, from what I understand. If you go into the mountain into New York State, there was a lot of clashes between indigenous people and the settlers. That's from what I understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Mohicans were one of the few tribes that sided with the English in here. The Stockbridge Indians were so-called were one of the only, and they had disastrous wars with the Mohawk, which were part of the Iroquois Confederacy. But a lot of the tribes in the Northeast were siding with the French, and the English in Massachusetts didn't have a lot of indigenous allies. So the Mohawk were but the Mohawk themselves had conflict with some of these other tribes. So they were already, they had already been targeted in some ways and driven from other areas and, lost territory. So, and then, sort of after the French and Indian War, after the Revolutionary War, was all just sort of, forgot we didn't need the extra help, and there was more and more settlers coming out. So, slowly the land in Stockbridge and other hunting land around the Berkshires was just, bought out and taken. And, it was mostly purchased, but the land sales weren't always, we didn't have the kind of forcible removal that other areas. And sometimes I think the Berkshires are almost envious, sort of the progressive Berkshires. I think sometimes we wish we had more of a Native American history to confront. It was relatively, brief, the interaction, so most of the people of the 1800s really had never even seen, Mohican member of the tribe. They were already gone. So, but we that sort of after the fact, we invented all kinds of legends about them. So most of our local Native history that we grow up with, Wahconah, Nessacus, Bash Falls, a lot of this is it's just purely white legends that people come up with 100 years after, the fact. Sometimes not until the late, 1800s, early 1900s. All these things, Wahconah and Nessacus, these are not Mohican words. Mahawi, these are, things that white people made up.
So that's a made up story. So just remind us what the legend is. I think I recall it, but the Wahconah, Nessacus.
Wahconah was the chief's daughter, and the evil shaman wanted her to marry Mohawk to make some kind of treaty or something, which is not solid ethnographic history. Is just like not how it worked. But so Nessacus was a Wampanoag who had fled here from the King Philip's War, probably the worst conflict that we know of in Massachusetts history in the 1670s. So it's set in this kind of concrete time period, unlike some of the native lore, but it's, there's no linguistic connection of these names and these words, and there's no evidence that any of these stories were in circulation before the late 1800s, way after.
Because again, during those times, a lot of stories were made up.
Yeah.
We go to the story of how baseball was invented, right? So we have our own sort of history there, but the original story is total malarkey. The original story being Abner Doubleday invented the game in Cooperstown, and a bunch of Civil War veterans or something, or whatever, started playing this game, and it was invented. It's a hogwash, right? But that was really common then. So I'm sure that's something you run into, like if you don't have any sort of like backing evidence to some of these things, people could make stuff up, and word of mouth is a really powerful thing. And then if someone writes it down on a piece of paper somewhere and circulates it, then there's a lot of legitimacy there. And
we're still making up local history, and especially when there's no one to challenge it like that, when there isn't a constant when there isn't a presence of a Mohican population living here to challenge it. The folks that are protesting the name change of the Taconic Braves are just fabricating their own like mythology. They're just there's this new, like I see on social media, just people repeating these recently made up or regurgitated facts. Like there was a tribe called Taconic, so like why aren't they changing the school? There was no Taconic tribe. There was no tribe named Taconic. That was the Mohican word for the mountains. Like we're just making up this new mythology to kind of knee jerk that our team name from high school, like that's my high school memories. Like you're destroying my fake Mohican history that I made up, that we made up in the 70s. So and it's like, it's crazy because historically most of the schools around here have had a ton of mascot changes. What was it? Herberg used to be, when it was South Junior High, it was the Sergeants, because the PHS Generals and the Sergeant, but all these, the middle schools, they've changed their mascot name. But the only one that has provoked this crazy rage that, that's out there now about it is the one where we're sort of being rightly called out that it was a racist name, because it is, because the National Congress of American Indians has said for like 30 years, please stop using names like this, specifically the name Braves. This is why it's offensive. Like this has all been out there since like Atlanta Braves were challenged 30 years ago. People had plenty of time to Google it, and educate themselves. But so it is bad. It is a bad look. It is a bad look. It's not really disputable, but there's this like total effort because we feel like we're being called out because it's somehow like our retroactively we feel like our high school memories are making us feel racist or something. I don't know, like if you were brave in high school, like that's not what it's saying. Like you were in high school, weren't trying to be, you didn't come up with a team name, you weren't trying to be racist. Like we get it.
Yeah,
no one's saying you're a racist because you're that was things, your, we're just changing.
It's okay to recognize
it's a completely, it's okay to change the high school mascot
with new information, with understanding history and life better. We can make changes, and that's okay. And it doesn't.
But if we don't want, if we don't want to know better, then we don't have to do better. If we just lie about it and make up misinformation, then we don't have to know better and do better. So we don't have to take an action.
It's it's good stuff, man. Covered a lot of territory this evening. I think that the more you delve into history, the messier it gets, and that's good. It really is. It really is a good thing, and it makes it interesting. And it makes it interesting, I know, for you, for what you do. But the history of this area, I mean, and you can take it as a microcosm of the whole thing in a lot of ways in our country, through our world. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, it must be fun doing this work that you do every day.
It really, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I think, and it can be a little like, it can be a little toxic, like imbibing, old historical newspapers just hour after hour, but it can be very heartwarming too. And I think, I love new homeowners. Like I love their enthusiasm about finding out about their house, but I got to say the favorite some cases that I've done for clients have been people who are former occupants or people who want me to research the home that they grew up in that somebody else owns now. And I got to kind of like discreetly take a couple pictures. But yeah, no, sometimes I reach out to the current owners if I need to. But yeah, I like if I can kind of reconstruct and give families back a little something about their own family heritage, a little like, maybe it's a clipping about their dad that they never saw, or a little detail, or just that kind of context of where their house fit in the narrative of the neighborhood and the people who lived there before, that sense of place. They seem really moved by that, and it's really like that's a great experience. Like that's what makes all the obituary scouring and like the 4 ticks I picked up last week and crawling around in cemeteries, worth it. It's because it is neat to connect that, and to see the way that people connect to not only where they live now, but where they have lived, and the lives, the parts of themselves that are history too.
Yeah. And I think, the other thing is you come from an interesting perspective, because I've seen you actually, because we were talking about this, the rosy glasses that people have for the past. And I saw a post of yours recently that said, wait a minute, I grew up and this is how it was. What I'm saying? Because we all look back and say, oh, back when I grew up, things were like this or things were like that. And, oh, wow, that was a wonderful time. But again, in that context, you look back and it's not rose colored glasses for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of this known historical fact that, every era has looked back as though there was a past good old days. They're going back to 3,000-year-old Sumerian tablets. People are talking about, the younger generation now is just so disrespectful, and they're just like, it's not the same. We remember the past as being more innocent because we were more innocent. It's not by and large the world that lost its innocence from when we were kids.
Personally,
it's us
was more because you were a kid. That's really interesting.
Yeah, we were hopefully people were basically happy and things were at least, if nothing else, simpler when they were kids. So people remember it as being simpler time. It was simpler times, but because we interpret everything out from ourselves as a default. So, of course, the times when we were kids were less complicated than the times we're living in now, because we like have to deal with the complexities of it now. This is like the simplest time in history for my 4-year-old. This is like, this is the best Springside Park's ever been, and this is it's a magical time. But you see every generation. It's just so people my age are saying it, and boomers are going like, you don't know how it was and the boomers might have the strongest case, because there is this like period from like post World War II to the early to mid 60s where things are kind of a little mellower, like the homicide rate is down and right, things, yeah. There's a lot of prosperity and a lot of people are doing fairly well. So there's kind of like that was, if there was a sweet patch, but it wasn't a sweet patch for everybody. It was like if you were a person of color, or
I was just gonna say that, right?
Still, so yeah, it's all relative to who we are and what we experience.
Yeah,
and
you had it really good baby boomers, and then you screwed it all up. Not just kidding. No disrespect to you, baby boomers out there, but not just kidding. Sort of. But that's. I think one of the first times I remember seeing you out in public, I don't know, maybe we'd met before, but was out at Springside Park. And it was that big concrete thing. I don't even know what to call it. It's not there anymore. I think they removed it, but this
most of it,
because we used to, when I ran cross country at Pittsfield High School, we'd get on top of that thing, this big massive concrete thing. I don't even know what it was there for.
It was a water reservoir.
It was a water reservoir.
It was weird. Okay. Yeah, GE built it for themselves. Yeah.
Like what? Like why would you put a water reservoir there? I don't know.
Well, back when GE was growing, they were very skeptical of the city's fire control capacity. So they pumped water from Silver Lake in a huge tunnel that's still under there. It's bricked off. My father stood on the GE side of it, but it ran all the way from Silver Lake up to, they pumped water all the way up the hill to that big
man.
concrete structure.
Holy cow.
Yeah, and this is like
So there's still
1910s
like a
that they built
tunnel
it.
under there.
Yeah, so underground it probably runs right under like about Norman Ave,
Okay.
and it's all underground. It's been sealed off for probably 100 years because they, by the 1920s, 30s, like I think the city's hydrants had caught up that GE wasn't like we're gonna lose everything.
Yeah.
So they abandoned it, and eventually in like 1960 they just, it was already like Springside Park was all around it, so they're like, yeah, the city will take this land.
Wow.
And luckily that was not a site we had to remediate. But
that's the thing, because I mean at that time what they put
it was
water
before they were putting PCBs in the water. Luckily,
I see.
When that
Okay,
was in
so Silver Lake is another thing. You've jumped in Silver Lake, right?
Yeah,
once or twice. So Silver Lake did exist. It wasn't a created lake, right?
No, yeah, it's on the earliest. It was expanded. It was probably
Because I think some people
smaller.
may think, oh, well, GE just must have made that lake so they could put their PCBs there or
Yeah.
something like that.
It's a fair assumption. I mean, we
Yeah.
changed the hydrology of this city so much. You look at the old maps. I mean, all the lakes have changed shape some, and the rivers and where we've dammed things off at Mill Street and Bel Air Pond and things like that. So yeah, I mean, we've hugely changed, and we changed the shape and the size, expanded Silver Lake, even before GE, when there was like a hat factory there. But you can see it's on the oldest like 1700s map. It's called Ensign's Pond, and it's right there. We had Ensign's Pond and Goodrich Pond, and they all had different names.
Why did they change it to Silver Lake? I wonder.
I don't remember exactly what year when it was changed. It was changed from Ensign's Pond because somebody named Ensign owned the land around it, to Hatter's Pond because there was a hat factory, and then probably after the hat factory was gone and nobody could remember why it was Hatter's Pond, they called it Silver Lake. And it was regarded as beautiful. It was this was a pristine
because it's
water
such a, I mean,
body in our
if you
city.
grew up, I mean, you knew like Silver Lake was like, it was embedded in your soul. Like you don't even go near that thing. You don't go, obviously don't go in it. It was so heavily polluted, but then that sort of connection between the word silver almost says, okay, well, it's full of like metals and stuff like that, as opposed to
I think it was originally meant to be beautiful and
right,
scenic. Yeah,
right, exactly.
No, it's just like
on
heavy metal toxicity.
Fall morning, it's just crystal clear, and maybe it seems like silver or something like that. But
because it wasn't all auto, malls up and down East Street, and it wasn't. But it's been, it was heavily industrialized, and a lot of our lakes. And I think what people forget now is just like, you almost have to worry more about the local lakes that had all kinds of mills and commercial businesses dumping stuff, not PCPs necessarily, but petroleum and other things for years and years, and haven't had an EPA mandated like multi-million-dollar cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
And that was people, thought I was out to lunch when I jumped in Silver Lake. It's just like, I mean, that was when the swimming was best it's ever going to be. They just put that sand cap in
there. Yeah.
Who knows if that sand cap's going to work long term? I'm not sure that was the right design, but I'm not an expert. So this is like freshly pumped in clean water. The swimming was good. But who knows? Goodrich Pond is probably now far more polluted now. But who even knows about Morewood Lake and things like that? These have all had been industrialized lakes.
Who used Morewood Lake? Because I know
it was the ice place for a while. Yeah.
Okay, so it's right near. I know it's right near railroad tracks, but so maybe there's some runoff there. So what was near Morewood Lake?
So like opposite side of the country club, opposite side of the lake, you can still find, if you crawl around in the bushes, you can still find all the footings and the concrete. There was a ice manufacturing outfit there, and they'd cut ice off the lake, haul and just load it up onto trains, and it was a big business. Dozens and dozens of people working there during the winter. Yeah, no refrigerators. So
refrigerator.
Yeah, so you're so you had to buy, if you needed ice for shipping things or keeping anything, you had to buy it, like from lakes. It came from lakes.
So they were literally
just cutting it out, putting it on conveyors, and bringing it up to the railroad tracks.
Who knew there's so much money in ice?
Biggest industrial accident in Pittsfield. It was when that place blew up. Boiler blew up, went sky high, 17 dead. Really, yeah, bad. Yeah,
Wow.
pretty much killed the ice business on that lake.
And the country club was there at the time?
The country club, yes, yeah, the country club was relatively newly formed. That had been the Morewood family property originally, but not originally, but before country club.
Huh. So it was late 1800s, maybe. What?
Yeah, I think. Well, they started. Yeah, I think they started organizing the country club around late 1890s, and they bought that property shortly thereafter. Yeah, the exact year escaping, but that's a very old house. It's a 1700s house.
Oh, is the house still there, or
the country club house?
Oh, so
yeah,
the one right on South Street.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but
they owned everything around there. Yeah, the whole estate for most of.
Yeah, I think, and some of those bigger estates, it's funny because as I'm saying, I'm like, yeah, duh, it's the big house right on the road. That was a house, and they converted it into the country club, and a lot of those big, like as an example. Well, first of all, is there any recognition of that accident anywhere?
Like a plaque or something? No.
Just any kind of, you think the country club may have something.
No. I ran a piece in my Berkshires a while ago, and I think every once in a while they'll like a retrospective will run in the Eagle or something. But it was by far the worst.
Wow.
It was on par with some of the losses that the Hoosick Tunnel and the just instantaneous tragedy.
Huh.
Dozens wounded, and then just 17 just instantly killed. Yeah.
So that was the Morewood property, and then so you have the Hillcrest, which tell me about that one a little bit. Off of, well, it's Tor Court now, but off of West Street, presumably, and then that ultimately turned into the hospital. But that was originally, I assume, a big property,
Gilded Age mansion, basically. Pittsfield. I mean, Pittsfield gets left out of these kind of Gilded Age cottage mansion because a lot of our stock didn't survive. And it was not the New Yorkers like Pittsfield's, whereas Lenox and Stockbridge got a lot of New York society and New York money. Pittsfield was like called the Chicago colony people. It was a lot of Chicago wealth.
That's interesting.
Built their summer estates.
I never would have thought that.
Yeah. And a lot of them have been torn down. A lot of the houses that I profiled are built on and sometimes from materials that were salvaged from a lot of these big houses that were down on East Housatonic, and they had you probably remember the Bartlett Ave Elmwood that burned, the apartment building that burned a few
was that
years
originally
ago.
Wasn't that the first Miss Hall's or is that a different building?
I think it was at one point. And that was the Larned estate, and they everything on that whole section of Bartlett Ave didn't exist. It was just that estate. And these so there was a lot of houses over there that were like the entire block now, and it's now a city block. But they went down. Pittsfield had much more of a housing like crunch than Lenox or Stockbridge ever did.
Well, so the other thing is you can imagine in sort of a mini urban area, you have then these conversions of use. So as an example, Hillcrest didn't sit there and become, a Ventford Hall or something like that. Someone said, hey, let's put a hospital here. And ultimately they did. And you can probably take maybe a few of those examples. I don't know any others. That's just the top of my head. But some that may have been converted. I don't know what Miss Hall's was originally on Holmes Road. I think that was just built just for that.
Well, they bought a mansion. They bought an earlier mansion, the Colonel Cutting mansion. It burned down. So the original Miss Hall's on Holmes Road burned down, and they rebuilt. I think around in the late 50s or 1960s. So the oldest buildings now are more recent, but it was originally an estate. Like Canoe Meadows was an estate. That house is Gravesley is long gone. A lot of the houses didn't. So although Oliver Wendell Holmes estate out on Holmes Road, you can Airbnb a little cottage out on that.
Now, which house is that? I've always wondered. Honestly, I grew up off Holmes Road.
You can't see it from the road. It's one of those winding lanes that comes off of Holmes Road on the left,
the east side
towards Lenox
of the road. Okay, on the
on
the east side. Okay. Yeah, you can't see it from the road, but okay.
Yeah, so there's
Because you
few
got a
in
lot
the-
of you know it's Holmes Road, and
Yeah.
and you got a Oliver off of it, and so there's
Yeah.
Wendell's and other street. I
They
don't know if
got
they're all.
like,
I don't know if that was all, but that's something that you know growing up in Pittsfield, I mean, these streets, but at some point, I'm sure you became fascinated with just how street names were named.
oh yeah, and renamed a lot of times too. That's one of the things that makes my job hard, and one makes people need to hire me too, is that when you research that, sometimes your street wasn't named your street, for its whole history. Some streets that I've done have been renamed twice, and then a lot of them have been renumbered too. So if you're going back with a certain address, your house, I just did a property, the Love Us and Leave Us dog daycare. That place has had like 5 different addresses over the.
No kidding.
Yeah,
that little side street off of West Housatonic Street.
Yeah, it's been considered part of 3 different streets, and it's been listed under like 5 different addresses over time. So it was it was like kind of a beat.
It's a really
looking through it all.
a weird one, and I can't remember the name of the middle street that is there, but Gale Avenue, and Gale Avenue has, for kind of being an out there street, it has quite a bit of history.
Yeah, it's kind of old.
And so but it kind of winds around, and it used to be just Gale Ave went straight through, and now it kind of it turns into another street.
Yeah.
And they rename that area, and then it reconnects to outer Gale Avenue. And the old timers on Gale Ave talk about how Gale Avenue, you can take it on the map of the city of Pittsfield and draw a line, and it connects right perfectly with William Street. And allegedly that was part of the Boston to Albany Stagecoach Road or something like that. That's the story that that I heard. I don't know if that was a sort of older major thoroughfare that went east and west, or no.
Kind of. I mean, all those West Pittsfield streets have been rerouted some. There's Route 20 is the oldest and longest road in the country. So Route 20's been there pretty long, since back in the Shaker days, and gone all the way to the West Coast. But the intersection near where Barker Road came off of it, Gale Ave, all these streets have been slightly rerouted over time, sometimes a couple of different times. So yeah, when you look on the maps, there's streets that were straight that now they're like, wavy. There's streets that were wavy that now they're like more of a acute angle. So it's fascinating to see how the land has changed. And West Pittsfield's tricky too, because the mapping wasn't as good as some parts of town. Like, they'd get out to a certain point and they're like, all right, the Pomeroys, and then here there be Shakers, so
Darby Shakers.
but then we started having the streetcars, and we needed like a little bit better mapping to stops and things like that. And they had what was called the Shaker Depot for the railway out, the streetcars out.
And what the hell happened to that? Where did they go? Why did they just get rid of?
They didn't have any babies
because they were no.
Oh, the Shakers. I'm like, where do they go?
I'm talking about the
John. Do you know how this works?
I'm talking about the streetcars. So
they pulled them all up. Cars killed them so fast. Yeah. It was a short period of Pittsfield history. It was short, and it was very resented. It was by many people hated it as much as people hate bike lanes now in Pittsfield.
They hated the streetcars, or
the streetcars,
or pulling them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they hated the streetcar. Well, I mean, in classic Pittsfield fashion, Pittsfield hated them when it went in, and they hated it when people took it out. They were offended, and like the boat in Allendale, hated it when it was put in, cried when it was taken out.
And we look back and say, "Oh, remember that
loss.
boat."
Tragic loss.
That is funny.
Of these
the funny
things.
thing is, I don't know. What's really weird? Why are there seagulls at Allendale? I don't understand that. And I mean, I don't know.
Because of the boat.
I know. It's like,
generations later, the stories are still told among the gulls.
The gulls were never there when I was a little.
And French fries. Probably people dropping French fries from that massive
pit. But I always wonder that. Like I don't know. There's an old story about how you don't see a lot of pigeons in downtown Pittsfield.
Yeah.
There's an old story I don't know if it's true, although I heard it from a really good source that they literally poisoned the pigeons. You'll have to look this one up.
It wouldn't
But,
surprise me.
yeah,
There was a guy shooting pigeons
I'll-
downtown at one point.
I'll tell you. I mean, it's not funny because I mean, literally, they they just all dropped dead. But that's the story. I'll tell you the source after the show. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna out him. But you know, again, weird things. But that boat, you know, originally it was the idea that, oh, Pittsfield is a sinking ship, and that, but that's not what the artist was intending at all. You know, I don't even know what the artist actually was intending. It's just kind of like, I thought this was cool to put this half of a boat like that looks like it's sinking.
Yeah, that was like his thing. You know, he did half thing sculptures of things, you know, coming out of the ground. It was like, you can Google some of his other pieces, like, but I think at the time he did say it was rising. It was like,
right,
right. It was like,
that's a weird way.
The CB was rising.
That really is a weird way to say, right? Like there's other, maybe, you know, a phoenix was coming out of the parking lot or something.
Well, there's a long history of phallic architecture, you know, rising up out of the ground. But Allendale, I mean, what a Coltsville is one of those things you look at and like, what a travesty of development from an original, you know, what was its own kind of like intact little community with its own school, its own post office, it was like a little borough of Pittsfield. And up until, you know, even into the 40s, it was, you know, and then you can look at aerials from like the 30s to the 50s and see like they just trashed it. They just strip mauled it and asphalted it and killed the neighborhood.
Yeah, and there are examples of. I mean, of course, there are cities that were completely. I mean, if you look at North Adams as an example, they really screwed up their downtown. I mean, they used to have these beautiful, and they tore up half of it. We kind of saved like a good chunk of our downtown. Like, so downtown was sort of salvaged through urban renewal. It was, I mean, yes, everyone bemoans the loss of the train station, and that was a big loss. Yeah. But compared to many other communities, we did pretty well through urban.
We didn't take down renewal. As many blocks as North Adams.
Yeah, North Adams really was devastating, but not, you know, again, those are just two cities. But I look at a city where I spent a lot of time because I went to college in Philadelphia, and traditionally in Philadelphia, they have 4 squares, sort of 4 squares and then a center square. And the center square is the city hall. And then they have these like sort of 4 corners. And you can look at each of them and see how urban renewal either left them completely unscathed or completely devastated it. And if you look at a place like Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, it's amazing. It's beautiful. There's restaurants around. It's very expensive housing in that nearby area. And then there's another one, I think it's Franklin Square, which is literally surrounded by highway on-ramps and all that. And it's just a ghost town and it's a mess. You know, it's nothing you'd want to bring your kid to. It's literally a park that is like a ghost town, and so forth. So you can see how planning can completely make or break any area. And so like Allendale, I mean, that was at the time, they're like, okay, this is the new thing. We're shopping and transportation, and people are going to go in and out, and this is going to be how we're going to do things. It really was devastating to a cohesive neighborhood. You can't even, you talk about bike lanes. How do you even walk from the Allendale shopping center, that vicinity, to out to Berkshire Crossing? There's not even a sidewalk there. I mean, it's really a disaster as far as planning goes. And now we got a Taco Bell out there too. So let's just you know, I could
there's no sign of a massive improvement in the coastal area.
I mean, it was funny because my good friend Chris Yan was really committed to saving that old crane building.
Yeah, I remember that.
That's now urgent care, right? And so and so it was interesting because the developers and everybody had said, well, you know, Zenas Crane never slept there. This building is, you know, they literally said that. And she worked so hard, and they saved it. They found something that would go in there, and they actually saved it. And then ironically, right next to it, they rip up this whole area, part of the boulders, trails and wildlife and everything to put this Taco Bell there. It's just like, man, sometimes you think, you get some progress here, and then it's just like the right palms are greased. I don't know. I don't know. How did they put that there? Anyway, that's
I mean, I think, so many years of usage, we had opened the gates for them.
Yeah,
we
true.
to the point we'd be singling them out if we didn't let them,
Right.
do the same crap everybody else has been doing out there for decades. But yeah, that crane building was really interesting. It proved like the demolition delay ordinance works. It works. And I do some of one piece that I did recently for a client was a demolition order. It was for the top of the old bakery on Seymour Street, the corner of Seymour and Wahconah there. That's going to be a cannabis shop, which is another layer of changing usage that we're seeing now. But the criteria, it makes sense to have the historical commission look and check and really do the due diligence. And to be the one, I think you were on the council when it was decided to take the community development board kind of out of that loop and make the final authority, the historic commission.
I think so.
Yeah, because I think it was like after the North Street comment, and the historical commission said there should be a delay, but the community development board overruled them, and then we realized like maybe the community development board doesn't need to be in the loop on historic decisions. So yeah, because there's a different perspective. I mean, the CDB is development. They're kind of there to be pro development and to get the development, and so it's a different mission, but it works. That was a building that they still could have demolished it after enough of a delay, but the delay was enough. Giving a 6 month or 1 year where you're like, no, you can't demo and make it sell it to this person right here.
Yeah,
you got to.
I wish it had worked. I wish it had worked on the old Plunkett School, which is now a complete disaster because there's nothing there. And I think that's a lesson in community development. I don't know if there's anything that could have been done back then that could have changed it, other than maybe giving the developer hindsight, because they went on, they tried to do the same thing at St. Mary's, and that didn't work. And they realized at that point, you're not really going to mess with this city council, because they're going to not give you a drive-through. And so it's politics. But it was a building that had a great possibility, especially when we're always looking for places for market rate housing, and David Carver is a guy who would develop something like that, and ultimately make that investment. And we were sold a bill of goods. Like, we were being told this building is no good, and it's falling down. That was baloney.
Yeah, it was
malarkey.
Structurally, it was good. I toured that building, and it had so much potential. It had so much potential. There was a perfect storm of, there was an owner who wanted way more than the value of the building for it, which Duncan Kafua Management was willing to pay. They, they have that resources, and they can make that back quickly from the space, from the lot. So, so they had somebody who was willing to pay way over its value. It's a sort of thing that if they had interest, there were other buyers interested, just not at the kind of price that Kafua would have paid. So it was something where, if we had better incentives, that's another thing that could have, if we'd had if the Community Preservation Act had been even, a glint in the eye, and for Pittsfield at that point, that might have been something that, the owner or developer might have looked at, like, I can get some funding to preserve this. And we as St. Mary's has, as the Tyler Street Firehouse is now getting, the Community Preservation Act is going to save a lot of buildings that we couldn't save before. And that was part of the energy. I think, you remember that campaign. And you did an endorsement for us. And there was this, this...
After I didn't endorse it the first time. Yeah. The first time it came through, it was seen as, well, it's just another tax. And so I was in the mayor's office at the time, and the mayor didn't support it at the time. The council president didn't support it at the time, although the vote, I don't think, was that lopsided. I think
it was like 60-40.
60-40.
It was about the reverse of how it was 10 years later.
Oddly enough. And I think that was a lesson learned, because there was so much we could have done during that time. I certainly changed my approach to it, and I think it's been beneficial since then, because you've seen it being used. And I think it's just a matter of like this is where the free market doesn't always work. When you just, because there are confines that you put in, and you try to put that in zoning, and like in this world, zoning is like a big deal. Is it a commercial property? Is it a residential property, and all that? What kind of, and so that is your broader framing and your sort of contract that you have with every property. So when someone goes into a property, they know that there's a certain parameter, but then you go a step beyond that. And sometimes there are permits, and then there are special permits. But this gives you another tool for the government, and the government should be representing the people, to value things that may not be valued in the free market at that moment in time.
It gives the public an extra layer to of ability to guide the course of the community, besides just capitalism as factors. It gives us some ways to guide for like a longer sighted
capitalism
view.
Is not perfect, right?
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
Yeah, I know. Kind of comes as a shock, but so it's and I think part of the difference too over 10 years is we were able to calculate too what we had lost. We were able to have a hindsight that was better. I'm not sure it was packaged in that perspective. We were going to lose registry of deed. All these fees were going out the window. Local homeowners were paying fees into it, and it was going to Northampton and other towns who had adopted CPA. So I think we were able to calculate, like, over 10 years, we've, Pittsfield residents have paid like $2 million to put in parks and like preserve buildings in other towns, and got none of it back. So that was a factor too. We were able to assess and since that time, it's been millions of dollars have gone into local projects. The dog park, the renovations at Springside House, the St. Mary's building, little things that the Athenaeum's been able to do, preserving archival stuff. And, because, there's a lot of CPA is great because it's a very local process. It's a local committee.
Yes.
It's available to, it's accessible to a small grassroots organization can sit down and write out this application and apply to local people who aren't making decisions from Boston, like a grant application or something, and know the value, know like what something means to a community, like specifically in ways that can't be like
and to
quantified.
Do things that really, I mean, you look at it. I used to be the Ward 6 counselor, West Pittsfield, and there's this little tiny West End cemetery out there.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think there are some who are very critical of this. What are we spending money on? But like, how else do you fix that? Because it's kind of a highly specialized situation when you have like tombstones that may be broken, or a framework or fencing that needs to be improved, and like the city's not going to do that stuff. I mean, you're not going to send.
That could be a regular capital.
You're not going to
send
DPW out there and like fix this 100-year-old fence situation. You need to have some sort of specialization there, and that's a tool that allows you to do those kinds of things that have value, but may not necessarily face or able to be paid for in the normal budget, as you said.
And Pittsfield in many ways was slow to that game because it's a different thinking than some other smaller communities that have always been really glued to their history and have always been there. There's things that would have been unthinkable to do in Lenox and Stockbridge that Pittsfield was, it was just a different industrial, corporate, meat and potatoes, GE culture, thought it was
still is to some extent. I mean, if you look at it,
there.
And a lot of times I'll be consulted by statewide political people who are running for office, and they want to know about the Berkshires and that sort of thing. And really, Pittsfield is a very conservative Democrat type city. I mean, they have a D next to most of their names as far as voters, but they're very conservative. They're not like the liberals in Great Barrington or Williamstown, that sort of thing, that see the world differently. It's much more of a blue collar kind of lunch pail, maybe pro-union, but not even always that.
We're like that half distance between Williamstown and Cheshire, politically. Or something,
something like that. But it really it is interesting. It's a different mentality
Yeah.
out there.
And GE was hugely, I think, I don't think we can overlook just how much GE changed our culture. I mean, books have been written about the GE management, style and thinking. Alec Baldwin had a character on 30 Rock that was just literally, constant spoof of like the GE culture of like, a certain kind of slightly liberal conservatism, but like straight lace, white shirt, not too artsy, like not big avant-garde theater like Town Players artsy, like community, and not to diss Town Players at all, but like arts within certain bounds. I think, which was like the Cultural Development Office and that whole idea when that came around, that was pretty radical for Pittsfield. That was to be able to court Barrington stage and to have this brief arts renaissance that we did have for like a decade there before all the galleries closed and administrations completely stopped supporting it. And it just was,
but those ideas are still valid. Those ideas are still valid.
That was the only time in the last 50 years we stopped losing population in Pittsfield. It was during that arts that arts renaissance. We actually grew jobs. We actually tiny bit grew population by maybe a few hundred people instead of losing, as we've been steadily doing for the last 50 years. So it was working. The arts and prosperity study that they did there was pretty clear. Like it was proven to work, but we didn't stay the course there in Pittsfield with that.
But even I mean, you are 100% correct. I mean, and I think,
but we're lucky. We still got Barrington stage, and we're lucky we got the Colonial redone, and we got Barrington located here, and so we're still getting dividends from that. As far as I'm concerned, it could have been more, it could have been pursued, but
it's interesting because that building alone has quite an amazing history. Barrington stage, which was the Union Theater, and then a history even before that, before it was called, it was always, maybe it was built
before it was the movie theater. It was it was like vaudeville and stuff like that. And Union Square was and it was I think it was really interesting the way it was that transition from like, I think they had films there in the silent era, but then silent era films weren't that big of a draw in Pittsfield, I think. So it kind of went back towards that. Then they had a stock company there, and one of those actors went on to very prominent film and stage things. And then his wife was murdered by a serial killer. But that's also on my macabre Roaring 20s tour. So just a plug there. But and then the talkies came out, and talking pictures. It's hard to picture being as interested in. I've watched silent films, but I'm not like at home and relaxing at night watching silent films. It's more work cerebrally. So talking.
There was a very famous actress. I think you wrote about, maybe not socialite actress. I don't know. So I can't remember her name, but you wrote about her recently.
Yeah. There are. Well, I mean, I think people forget the Colonial and the Union Square and the Palace. We got big name talents. We had national people. What's his name there? Not Charlie Chaplin, but Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton performed in Pittsfield's several times. There was a certain 1920s actress who her and her husband were very much on the rise in theater, and they kind of put down roots in Pittsfield for a little while, and they bought the notorious Meadowview Inn out in Coltsville, which had been like
the notorious it was an inn.
It was always called notorious. Well, it had a lot of liquor violations, let's put it that way. Not that a lot of places in Pittsburgh, I mean, even before Massachusetts has had this ongoing prohibition struggle. So that's one of the things.
I wonder, like the notorious, because it's like, well, is it the ones that are just targeted by local authorities, or are they really the ones that are just doing bad things? I always, you kind of wonder that, because even through our history and not too far back, or maybe even today, I mean, there are establishments that maybe more targeted than others. I mean, I think it's fair to say like our friends at Methuselah's were targeted quite a bit recently, maybe more scrutiny than other establishments. So you could imagine that historically, there were some establishments that were more targeted than others.
I'm sure there was. I think the only real difference is there was much more zealous, like moral crusade atmosphere going on. So there was like less people getting away with it because like for some periods, like, you know, when Chief Sullivan was in there and Chief Nicholson and stuff, there was just like no, like they didn't like liquor. They didn't like men dancing without coats. They didn't like, we had a coatless dancing ban in Pittsfield. This is real talk.
When was that?
This is like late 20s, early 30s. It was, you know, the men at the line dances and stuff it was getting,
God.
You know,
so
sexy.
there had to be a lot of
sexy,
there had
sweating.
to be speakeasies.
Oh yeah, I mean, there was liquor raids nonstop from the 1850s through the 1930s in Pittsfield. The Pittsfield Police Department, like most Massachusetts towns, was formed for the purpose of stopping out of control alcohol consumption and morals offenses by women. Basically, this is what police had, you know, historically in Massachusetts, the enabling legislation.
And what did we do before police? What did we do before police?
There was a high sheriff of Berkshire County, and they, you know, occasionally hire like, you know, night, but there were no towns and cities didn't hire their own police or constable. Churches hired privately. Police forces were partly to stop the churches from hiring their own people to go after bootleggers.
Wow.
Because before Massachusetts had its liquor ban in like 1855 or whatever, there was just the churches like didn't like people drinking. They couldn't legally do anything about it, but they'd hire private detectives to, like, you know, bust them out.
Yeah, and if they were, you know, seen, I assume at that time, if the church kind of called them out, that was like a major ostracizing for an individual to
some people didn't care,
or some people think
people weren't as religious in the 1800s.
That's interesting.
You know, I mean, if you wanted to be like really respected in the chamber and type organizations and things like that, you had to do some things were, but for, you know, if you were,
those people just drank at home, I guess. I don't know, maybe.
But I mean, they were caught sometimes in the saloons on Fenn Street, Mechanics Road. I mean, this was the thing, is like, you know, half the population was heavily for banning alcohol for many years, but more than half, but, you know, some of them also drank, you know, like they felt it should be banned, but they also drank. You know, they also violated.
But what's this 1855?
So 1855 was like a liquor ban period for Massachusetts until the 1870s. Not complete liquor ban, but you know, spirits and things like that. There had been recurring. I mean, they started in the early 1800s with the 15-gallon rule, was that you couldn't you couldn't buy less than 15 gallons of anything. So it was just like rich people could drink, you know, if you could afford to have more, and you couldn't serve in bars and things like that. So then they just started.
You went to the warehouse, and you had to buy 50. You couldn't buy 14 gallons.
Or you could pay to see like a spotted pig. You'd have a spotted pig party, and you'd pay this large cover charge to see the spotted pig, which was just a pig with like paint spots on it, and you'd pay this handsome cover charge and drink free all night. That was legally acceptable because they weren't selling you. Somebody could buy 15 gallons and then serve it in pints for free with a handsome cover charge for the entertainment. And the entertainment could be total BS and just get you there to, you know, to free. That's part of the reason why Massachusetts doesn't allow like drink discounts or free drinks or anything like that. That goes way back to, that was a loophole to get around the early prohibitions.
You know, that is so amazing. I'm still fascinated by the fact that police departments were created in such a way. People don't know that. I mean,
I didn't know until I started looking at the,
you know, if you're, you know, less than 100 years old or so, why would you think that police departments were created for any other reason than for public safety and in the way that we think about it today? You know, crime, people, you know, to make sure people aren't killing each other and that sort of thing. But that's not really
because people are opening saloons right next door to the churches, and the churches found it unacceptable. And this was turning into warfare. I mean, the Methodist church out in Chester, Mass, was bombed. It was bombed and burned to the ground. And then they in turn bombed, the Carson League was like the temperance church league back then. They meant business. They were like hiring people to shoot up bootleggers and stuff like it. So this was like a huge moral conflict for the heart and soul of Pittsfield, and especially not to be tolerated was public drunkenness by women. That was like this sign that moral decay would, that it was the end of the world.
Wow.
Public drunkenness by women was like this huge trigger. So and it's no accident that the police stations before this one was built, the other police station was right by it. It's right on that Fenn Street, the boundary between the old liquor territories and the churches. And it was a battle line for decades.
Where were the liquor?
All down Fenn Street, Street.
You keep saying Fenn Street. Now it's funny because back early in my city council days, the city councilors would walk across the street to oh my God, I forgot the name. Lax Lounge.
Those are the days.
That was the place. You go a little bit further down. There's Sideline and there's Sims. I don't know if those are vestiges of this, but it sounds like Fenn Street was the hot spot.
Yeah, and originally it was like shacks and people's houses and stuff were the saloons and the bars. And Fenn Street, and then across north on the other side, it's not even a street anymore, but just that little kind of it's called Market Street, that lane between that goes down to what used to be Flavors. That was the worst den of iniquity in Pittsfield history. Mechanics Row was like, there used to be all these little shanty houses along both sides between McKay Street and North. And that was where a lot of liquor raids, brothels, dens of communists, allegedly. There was a couple of homicides down there unsolved.
So basically the central block area, that whole
just
area,
about just before
they built the central block, I assume. Okay.
Before England Brothers, and that's ultimately what did it. I mean, the police tried to get rid of Mechanics Row for decades, and it was only through gentrification of North Street retail that we got all the saloons, and then it moved a street down to a Liberty Street that runs off a Depot, kind of by Tito's there. That used to be like more of a street because it was all apartments all along the back.
Yeah, there's kind of an alleyway
building
there now on just to the
is that the Harvard Square building? And then the old brew works on the other side, but it used to be like apartments all along. It was all back doors and back porches, and that was like a real boozy brothely part of town after that. And then people got cars and they started being able to go to the Albany red light district, and we stopped having a real like red light district per se in Pittsfield because people went up to there
because it sounds like that it was more difficult to do that in Pittsfield, perhaps compared, maybe Albany was a different vibe there.
Yeah, the Albany had much more political participation. They occasionally, I mean, they would raid brothels there and find like half a dozen state reps, assemblymen, with in compromising positions with the ladies and stuff like that. So it was up until Rockefeller just bulldozed everything out there and turned it into something from like the Imperial City from Star Wars. That was a great old neighborhood architecturally. It was like this great, beautiful neighborhood, but it was full of there was shooting, stabbings, and a lot of prostitution activity and gambling, all the vices of the time.
Oh my gosh. So tell me about the tour, when that begins, and does it sort of focus in the downtown area?
Yeah, it's all entirely takes place in downtown. It's going to start at Persiff Park and kind of go around North Street in a loop, but that'll really that's going to kick off May 14th, and then I'm doing alternating weekends all through May and June. So it'd kind of be like one weekend on, one weekend off. I'll do Saturday night tours and Sunday matinee tours. I strongly would recommend people reserve in advance because I limit tours to 20 people. More than that, really, it's not a quality experience, I think, for people. So I think 20 is a really good amount of people to herd around Pittsfield. But it'll all be downtown on sidewalks and ADA accessible crosswalks, and it's really just going to kind of continue. I did the Macabre Pittsfield tours in October that were heavily 1800 centrics, and it really went into that stuff about how the police started and the prostitution and the opium dens of the 1800s. And this is kind of a sequel. It's all new stories of how some of those themes continued and intermingled with, the birth, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the this newfound freedom of women to vote, and all these different kinds of themes. So we'll see the heavy bootlegging that was going on in Pittsfield, because there was huge distilleries and there were shootouts with police, and it was like all the gangster stuff you see in the movies was here. And there were business owners like, creating like weird little pervy secret rooms in downtown buildings and stuff. Places you see every day that you would never guess the wild histories of. So there's going to be a lot of, but it's all ages, but it is definitely adult themes. It's there's going to be a lot of murder, suicide, some stark looks at racism and social tensions, and real issues that people were dealing with. It in some cases are very similar 100 years later. In some cases are kind of seem very foreign and alien.
This is great. I think I'm gonna take that tour, Joe. And I one of the best courses I ever took in college was a urban studies course, and I find it just really, and I know you do too, is taking a certain area and just being able to see the evolution of it. Sometimes and like you said, like the Allendale disaster, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, as far as urban, development and the planning that went into it, very, very love to go back and change that. But in a lot of ways, I think that is so fascinating, and I find myself, and I'm sure you do, and I think a lot of people do, when they walk into a place like Museum Facsimiles or sort of a historic building, and they run into these maps and they see these old maps, and they kind of like recognize some of the streets and then see how dramatically different it is, or in some ways kind of similar, or then you see these side streets that no longer exist in some cases. I think that's a real natural human fascination that people have, and I think it's really powerful and really great stuff.
Yeah, it's so neat to see the way, because I think it informs kind of the way that we, it explains things about why things are the way they are now. I mean, it's even like when you said why are we spending money on the West Part Cemetery, to restore, maybe some of the reasons why we're really good at cemetery upkeep now is because of how kind of shoddily we did Pittsfield handled it in the past. So I think sometimes it illuminates how we are where we are now, and hopefully at its best, history can sometimes like warn us. Sometimes we can start to recognize the structural similarities. Now it's a tough thing to do, because it's easy to see in hindsight, well, when we were working to get a ball stadium, that's probably when we should have been saving and redeveloping the England Brothers building. And when we were, worried about creating a whole bunch more parking in downtown in the 60s, that's when we probably should have been saving the train station and the Hotel Wendell and locking down that lodging and transportation. When we were letting G buy out local control, William Stanley, I'm not sure what we were focused on then. Balloons, maybe. It was big time for balloons, but and it's like, I think about the issues that we've been focused on in Pittsfield over the last 2 years. I mean, there's been a worldwide pandemic. Has that been a local focus as much as bicycles? Probably not. I mean, I feel like, the two biggest issues over the last 2 years have been like bicycles and cell towers. And there's a $60 million police station about to be built that's going to bust us out economically and socially. There's a lot of changes to the city council happening that are a little concerning, and the attitudes and views of some of these new counselors. There's a lot of really important like stuff that you could see the historical arc of that we need to be probably focusing on dealing with, like, and we're I don't know, maybe not as much as I'd like, but yeah, that's my perspective. That's my historian's perspective, I guess.
Joe Durwin for city council.
I've done that one before.
It's but it is good stuff. So I love it. I follow your stuff on Instagram, and especially on Instagram because it's visual, and a lot of those maps and images and that sort of thing. And I love it. I absolutely love it, and look forward to your content. And I'm really thrilled that people are interested in their own homes and properties and things like that give you this great work to do, which I think enriches us all, and certainly your own work every day. So that's really, really cool.
Yeah, shout out to my clients because they are allowing history to be uncovered, new history every day. That's it's a great thing that people are taking that investment, in their properties and taking that extra step to find out the heritage of it. And without it, I couldn't afford to do it.
Good stuff, my friend. Well, thanks for we went on an epic journey this evening, and we probably could still go on. I don't know, but I love it, and keep on keeping on, my friend.
Thank you. It's great to be on. Thanks.